Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Empire State, New York. New York State, of course, has the largest, or the most populous city anyway in the United States, New York City. Within that city alone, there are 722 miles of subway track, which would stretch from the city to about Columbus, Ohio. The state is also the birthplace of the oldest continuous newspaper, the New York Post, which was established in 1803 by Alexander Hamilton. And this is my favorite. Statistically speaking, you are more likely to be bitten by a New Yorker than by a shark. New York is not having a senatorial election or a gubernatorial election this year, which is good for my sake because it does have 27 congressional House districts, which I'm hoping to cover in some detail anyway. So let's move right along and get into that. I'll just list for you the districts that I consider to be competitive this November and then just list them in my window here so you have a visual too, because that helps me anyway. Out of New York's 27 House districts, there are a few that I consider to be at least moderately competitive this year, and they are New York's 2nd, 11th, 18th, 19th, 22nd, 24th, and 27th. You got all that? I'm just going to list all 7 of those in my window here, and next to them is the partisan lean associated with each district according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. And each district is colored accordingly to the party currently representing that district as of this video. So going back to 2018, there were 3 districts that flipped. They all flipped from Republican to Democrat 2 years ago. It was the 11th, the 19th, and the 22nd district. So right now all 3 of those districts have freshman representatives, and they are all, as I understand, running for re-election this year. I also want to mention briefly that last district, the 27th. The former representative of that district, Chris Collins, was forced to resign amid scandal involving insider trading on his end. Collins was a Republican, and his position has since been filled pretty recently, actually, I believe. Actually, Collins did run for re-election. Even after that story was made public, he won with less than a majority of the vote, though. He won 49% of the electorate, despite them knowing about his insider trading. So because of that, it seems kind of unlikely to me that that district would not elect a Republican candidate that is free of scandal as of this date. Therefore, I don't think the 27th district is as in play as these other 6, obviously also because of its partisan lean of being plus 11 into the Republican column. Okay, so as you can see, there are quite a few Democrats on this list running for re-election in districts that are, for the most part, more right-leaning compared to the national average. So to understand if these Democrats are likely to retain their position this November, let's pull up a line graph showing raw House turnout over the last decade for the entire state of New York. Let's pull that up right now. So looking at this, you'll see that New York is typical in the sense that it votes in higher numbers during presidential years. Those 2012 and 2016 figures are the spikes, and we see dips during midterm years. That trend even continues into 2018 to a lesser degree because we still see Democratic numbers that are really matching turnout from 2012. Because New York is a state that is populated by more Democrats than Republicans. We saw those Democrats turn out in pretty high numbers during the most recent midterms as a sort of lashing out against a president that they generally disdain, but we'll get into that in the next section. It's also the reason that the blue line has a much better slope value than the red line, specifically that value preceding X. That value of 310.8 in that equation you see for the Democrats means that on average over the last decade, every 2 years or every election cycle, there have been 310,800 additional votes for Democratic House candidates than there were in the previous election cycle. The Republicans have a value of 27.5, which is, what is that? That's like about a 12th of the value that the Democrats have. So if we look at the dotted lines, then we would use that to project into 2020, and we would see Democrats breaking away from Republicans in a pretty significant way. The number one cause for this major difference in slope value, I believe, is simply, it's because of 2018, honestly. You compare the raw numbers for 2018 for Democrats to those numbers in 2014 and 2010, and oh my gosh, it's just a major improvement for the Democratic Party. Okay, let's toss that graph aside now that you have an idea of how the state has been voting for House candidates as a whole. So because I've never had to predict this many House races at once, I'm gonna actually turn to Pollbot to help me keep this thing organized a little bit. We'll do one at a time, and he'll give us the results for how we predict that all these districts are going to turn out this November. So, Pollbot, let's take this one at a time. New York's 2nd district, currently controlled by a Republican. How does that go? Okay, New York's 2nd remains Republican this November. Next, we have New York's 11th district, currently controlled by a Democrat with a partisan lean slightly to the right. Pollbot, how does that go? And New York's 11th district remains Democrat this year. Next, we have New York's 18th district, currently controlled by a Democrat with a partisan lean of +1 into the Republican column. Pollbot, how does that turn out? Okay, New York's 18th remaining Democrat. Next, we have New York's 19th, currently controlled by a Democrat with a partisan lean of +2 into the Republican column. Pollbot, how does that go? And again, another incumbent retaining their seat in New York's 19th. Okay, next Pollbot, we have New York's 22nd district, currently controlled by a Democrat with a partisan lean of +6 into the Republican column. Pollbot, how does that go? Aha, and we have our first flip of the evening in the state of New York. New York's 22nd district will be going back to Republican after having flipped to Democrat in 2018. New York's 22nd is a district that voted for McCain in 2008 and Romney in 2012 by about a 1 to 2% margin each, but then in 2016 actually broke for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by about 15% of the vote. So I think having Trump at the top of the ballot this year will be enough to carry the Republican candidate across the finish line this November. All right, Pollbot, next we have, what is it, New York's 24th district, okay. Currently controlled by a Republican and, it has a left-leaning partisan categorization, +3 into the Democratic column. So Pollbot, how does that go? Okay. Second flip of the evening in New York's 24th, but in the opposite direction, we have an incumbent Republican losing to a Democratic challenger. New York's 24th is a district that covers the town of Syracuse, and they voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 by about a 10 to 15% margin, I believe, but then in 2016 went for Hillary Clinton by just under 5% over Donald Trump. So in the case of New York's 24th district, I think having Trump at the top of the ballot will actually help Democrats this year, which is the complete opposite of New York's 22nd, where I think having Trump at the top of the ballot will actually help Republicans. So that's our second flip in New York for the evening. We have, just one more competitive district, New York's 27th. Currently controlled by a Republican with a partisan lean of +11 into the Republican column. Pollbot, how does that turn out? Okay, and we have a Republican incumbent retaining their seat in New York's 27th. So if my memory is correct, we have a net change of 0. So ultimately, Pollbot and I predict 2 flips in the House, but in opposite directions, meaning that the party makeup of the U.S. House in the state of New York remains unchanged. Whew, we did it. Okay, let's make the House results official for the state of New York by putting it on our first map. Mark it. And now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. New York is a state that last voted for a Republican presidential candidate in 1984 when they elected Reagan over Mondale. More recently, though, in 2016, the state broke for Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump by about a 22% margin of the vote, which was a degraded performance from 4 years prior in 2012 when they broke for Obama over Romney by 28%. Let's take some time to learn more about how New Yorkers elect presidents by bringing up some presidential to House vote ratios. Let's look at those right now. Okay, and here we see some presidential to House voter ratios. Oh, they're all over 100%, but just by a little bit for both parties. Now, the reason I consider presidential to House vote ratios in my calculations at all is because they serve as a kind of tiebreaker in states where raw House turnout numbers are pretty competitive between Democrats and Republicans. And as you'll remember from our last section, Democrats have an incredible edge on Republicans as of this video. We saw them turn out in huge numbers in 2018 relative to Republicans, and we saw them turn out in greater numbers for both of these presidential years, 2012 and 2016. And both of those years saw the Democratic candidate winning the vote in New York by over 20%, despite having a slight disadvantage in these voter ratios. Basically, these numbers tell me that New Yorkers from both sides of the aisle are generally enthusiastic to vote for presidents relative to House candidates, and they do so by a similar margin. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside. The last piece of the puzzle is Donald Trump's approval rating in the state of New York. That's the last piece of our equation in our calculations. I'm sure he's not going to want to hear this, but as of this video, Donald Trump's approval rating in New York is minus 30 points. Specifically, he has the approval of about 33% of New Yorkers and the disapproval of 63%. So we bear in mind raw House turnout, his horrible approval rating, and the pretty insignificant presidential to House voter ratios. Let's look to Pollbot to see how this is going to turn out for Biden and Trump in November. Pollbot. There we have our result. Biden winning the state of New York by 25.68% margin of the vote. This number is peculiar to me in that it is pretty much right in the middle of how Obama performed in 2012 and Clinton performed in 2016. So I guess this means in New Yorkers' view, Biden's bringing a little bit of both of those candidates to the table this year. So now we have presidential results for the state of New York, and it's not that much of a surprise to me that it is quite blue. Let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So all the electoral results are in for the state of New York. We saw 2 flips in the House. We saw another Democratic victory for the presidency. Let's talk briefly about the future of the Empire State. Let's look at our old raw House turnout graph to try to get into this a little bit more. Let's look at that again. So this is the same graph we were looking at earlier. Of course, I just want to reiterate how much of an improvement 2018 was for Democrats relative to their previous midterm election years. That year alone is probably the reason their slope value is 310.8 as opposed to some value probably under 100. And it's becoming more and more evident that that huge increase in turnout is likely due to a very unpopular presidential administration. And looking a little bit closer at the model for Republican turnout, they do have a positive slope value there. It's mainly due, I think, to that slight spike in 2016. The numbers for that year were the greatest for both parties, actually. We saw more turnout for House candidates in 2016 for Democrats than they got in 2012, which is odd because they elected Obama by a much wider margin than they did Clinton. But then at the end of the day, we see a value in 2018 for Republicans that is virtually identical to that in 2010. So all signs point to a state that is solidifying its Democratic status. So yeah, let's toss that graph aside. And so yeah, my final consensus on New York is that it's going to continue to be a foundational piece in the Democrats' strategy at winning the Electoral College. Democrats showed up in great numbers in 2018. It's very likely that they'll continue that trend into 2020, whereas Republicans have barely improved their numbers at all in the last 10 years. New York City, very liberal place, just dominates the state. If we're talking about a few years from now, though, Florida recently passed New York in population total. So it seems likely that Florida will stand to gain Electoral College votes after this next census is finished, and New York may lose some. They both currently have the same amount of Electoral College votes at 29. So maybe we'll see New York's influence wane slightly, but it's definitely a reliable piece of the Democrats' strategy as of now. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.